HMS Argus was the world's first ship, completed with a full-length flush flight deck, a fact that earned her a place in every subsequent carrier design manual. Laid down in 1914 as the Italian ocean liner Conte Rosso and purchased by the Admiralty in 1916, she was converted at William Beardmore and Company's yard on the Clyde and commissioned on September 16, 1918. 54 days before the armistice ended the war, she was built to fight. Her 550-foot unobstructed deck was the solution to a problem that every previous aviation ship had failed to solve: how to land a wheeled aircraft at sea. HMS Furious had a landing on deck forward of the superstructure, but the turbulence generated by the funnel gases made it nearly unusable. 3 pilots were killed attempting landings on Furious in 1917. Argus eliminated the island entirely, placing the funnel gases aft through horizontal ducts. The solution created its own problems. The ducts reduced speed and the smoke interfered with deck operations, but the fundamental concept was proven. Argus served as a trials and training carrier through both World Wars, launching aircraft in Norwegian waters in 1940 and ferrying hurricanes to Malta in 1941. She never served as a frontline strike carrier. Her 20-knot top speed was inadequate by 1939 standards. She was scrapped at Inverkeithing in 1947. Her contribution was conceptual, not tactical. She proved the flush deck could work. Every carrier built since inherits that proof. HMS Hermes holds the distinction of being the world's first warship, designed from the keel up as an aircraft carrier, though HMS Hosho of Japan was commissioned 8 months earlier. Laid down at Armstrong Whitworth, Newcastle in January 1918 and commissioned on February 18, 1924, Hermes introduced the island superstructure offset to starboard, a configuration that became universal. The choice to build the island to starboard was empirical. Most pilots, being right-handed, naturally banked left when alarmed, and placing the island to starboard reduced the probability of a veering aircraft striking the superstructure. At 10,950 tons standard displacement, she was the smallest purpose-built carrier in any major navy. Her air group of 20 aircraft, initially Fairey Flycatchers and Blackburn Darts, was modest. Speed of 25 knots was adequate for 1924, but marginal by 1939. The Admiralty deployed her to the Far East in 1941, where she formed part of Force A under Admiral Sir James Somerville. On April 9, 1942, 85 Aichi dive bombers from the Kido Butai found her off Trincomalee. 40 bombs hit Hermes in approximately 10 minutes. She capsized and sank with 307 men. No fighter cover was present. Her aircraft had been disembarked ashore. The smallest carrier in the Royal Navy was also the first RN carrier sunk in combat, destroyed in an engagement she had no means to survive. HMS Furious lived 3 distinct lives. Laid down as a large light cruiser in 1915 with an 18-inch main gun, she was converted during construction with a flying off-deck forward in place of her forward turret and commissioned in July 1917. In August 1917, Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning became the first man to land an aircraft on a moving ship, touching down a Sopwith pup on Furious's forward deck. Dunning was killed on his 3rd attempt 5 days later when his aircraft was blown overboard. A second conversion in 1918 removed the aft turret and added a landing deck, but the intervening superstructure made both decks dangerous. Between 1921 and 1925, Furious was completely reconstructed with a full-length flight deck, funnels trunked aft below the deck level, and hangar space for 33 aircraft. The first successful flush deck conversion of a capital ship hull. At 31.5 knots, she was the fastest carrier in the world at her reconversion date. Furious conducted the first carrier-based airstrike in history on July 19, 1918, when 7 Sopwith Camels attacked the German Zeppelin base at Tondern, destroying 2 airships. In World War II, she participated in the Norwegian campaign and the attacks on the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau at Brest. She survived the war and was scrapped at Troon in 1948, having bridged the entire arc from experiment to established doctrine. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 permitted signatories to convert capital ships nearing scrapping into carriers, and the Royal Navy converted HMS Courageous and HMS Glorious, both built as large light cruisers in 1916, completing the work in 1928 and 1930, respectively. At 786 feet and 22,500 tons, they were the largest carriers in Royal Navy service at commissioning and introduced the 2-level hangar that became standard British practice, allowing 48 aircraft to be stowed below the flight deck. Both ships were lost within 12 months of the war's outbreak. HMS Courageous was torpedoed on September 17, 1939 by U-29 while conducting anti-submarine patrols in the western approaches, an assignment that sent a 22,500-ton carrier into submarine-infested waters without adequate destroyer escort. 519 men died. The Admiralty immediately withdrew carriers from anti-submarine duty. The lesson was elementary and cost the lives of more than half her crew. HMS Glorious was sunk on June 8, 1940, during the evacuation of Norway by the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. She was caught with no aircraft ranged on deck, her complement of Hurricanes and Gladiators unable to fly in time to defend her. Of 1,207 men aboard, 45 survived. Both ships demonstrated that carrier vulnerability, properly managed, was acceptable. Carrier vulnerability carelessly accepted was catastrophic. HMS Ark Royal was the first carrier designed under the 1930 London Naval Treaty constraints and the most capable warship the Royal Navy possessed at the outbreak of World War II. Commissioned on November 16, 1938 after construction at Camel Laird, Birkenhead, she carried 60 aircraft on 2 hangar decks and introduced mechanical deck lifts capable of handling aircraft up to 20,000 pounds. Her 800-foot flight deck was the longest of any British carrier at the time. Her combat record was defining. Swordfish from Ark Royal damaged the Bismarck on May 26, 1941. A torpedo hit that jammed her rudder and forced her to circle while the home fleet closed. Without that hit, Bismarck reaches Brest. The Admiralty confirmed the strike's decisive role in the subsequent Board of Inquiry. Ark Royal's aircraft were also central to operations against the Italian fleet at Spartivento and Force H operations throughout 1940 and 1941. On November 13, 1941, U-81 put a single torpedo into Ark Royal's starboard side, east of Gibraltar. The damage should have been survivable. A series of damage control failures over 14 hours allowed flooding to spread unchecked. She capsized and sank 30 miles from Gibraltar. 1 man died. The loss investigation identified systemic failures in stability management and damage control training that were corrected fleet-wide. She sank because of human error. The ship itself was not the problem. The Illustrious class represented a deliberate British choice to trade aircraft capacity for survivability. The design incorporated a 3-inch armoured flight deck, the only carrier class in the world to do so, which reduced the hangar to a single deck and cut the air group from Ark Royal's 60 to 36. The naval staff argued that the Mediterranean theatre demanded carriers that could absorb bomb hits and continue operating. They were correct. On January 10, 1941, HMS Illustrious absorbed 6 direct hits from Ju-88 and Ju-87 dive bombers south of Malta and survived. An American carrier of the same period would have been lost. The price was operational. 36 aircraft could not generate sufficient sortie rates for offensive fleet operations. American Essex-class carriers commissioned from 1943 operated 90 aircraft. The armoured deck philosophy prioritised defence over offence, which suited British strategic circumstances but constrained carrier aviation's contribution to the war. HMS Formidable was struck twice by kamikaze aircraft off Okinawa in May 1945. Damage control teams had both fires out and the deck operational within hours. Illustrious was scrapped in 1956, Formidable in 1953. Victorious was extensively modernised between 1950 and 1958 at a cost of £30 million, more than her original construction price, and served until 1968, when a fire during a refit sealed her fate. HMS Indomitable was a modified Illustrious ordered after the naval staff acknowledged that 36 aircraft was operationally inadequate. The design introduced a second, lower hangar within the armoured box, a structural compromise that increased aircraft capacity to 45 to 48 at the cost of reduced hangar headroom in the lower deck. Aircraft with folded wing heights exceeding 14 feet could not use the lower hangar. The constraint affected several aircraft types throughout her service life. Indomitable was commissioned on October 10, 1941. She ran aground off Jamaica during working up trials in November 1941, a damage incident that kept her out of the Eastern Fleet long enough to miss the Japanese onslaught that sank Hermes and Prince of Wales. She joined the Eastern Fleet in April 1942. In August 1942, during Operation Pedestal, the convoy operation to relieve Malta, she was hit by 2 bombs from German aircraft, flooding both hangars and forcing emergency repairs at Gibraltar. 17 aircraft were destroyed. She survived torpedo damage in July 1943 during the Sicily landings and 2 kamikaze strikes off Okinawa in May 1945. The armoured deck deflected both kamikazes. She returned to Britain in 1945, was placed in reserve in 1947, and was scrapped at Faslane in 1955. Her service life traced the full arc of wartime carrier operations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a record no other Royal Navy carrier matched. The Implacable class represented the final evolution of the armoured carrier concept, an attempt to combine the armoured deck of the Illustrious with a substantially larger air group. HMS Implacable and HMS Indefatigable achieved this through a lengthened hull and a third sub-hangar storage deck. Aircraft capacity nominally reached 81, though operational figures of 48 to 54 were more typical given maintenance requirements. Both ships commissioned in 1944, too late to influence the European War. Implacable joined the British Pacific Fleet in July 1945 and participated in strikes against the Japanese home islands in July and August 1945. She was present at the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Indefatigable also served in the Pacific and was struck by a kamikaze off Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, suffering only superficial damage to the armored deck, a hit that would have caused catastrophic damage to a wooden-decked carrier. Both ships were placed in reserve immediately after the war. The Royal Navy lacked the budget to modernize or operate them in peacetime conditions. Both were scrapped at Dalmuir in 1955, less than 11 years after commissioning. Their scrapping represented a strategic choice the British government made consciously. Carrier power was unaffordable. HMS Unicorn was designed as a fleet carrier maintenance ship, a concept unique in naval history at the time of her commissioning on March 12, 1943. The Admiralty recognized that sustained carrier air operations required an afloat maintenance capability to overhaul engines, repair airframes, and return aircraft to operational condition without returning to port. Unicorn was built with workshop facilities, engine test benches, and 2 hangars capable of conducting major aircraft maintenance at sea. Wartime necessity converted her role almost immediately. The shortage of operational carriers meant Unicorn served as a light fleet carrier in the Mediterranean from 1943, conducting strikes during the Sicily and Salerno landings with an air group of 35 Seafires and Swordfish. The dual role compromised both functions. Her workshop facilities were disrupted by operational flying, and her maintenance capacity was consumed by her own air group rather than fleet-wide support. She served in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, providing logistics support and limited operational flying. Korea was her most sustained combat deployment. The concept of afloat aviation maintenance that Unicorn proved was incorporated into American logistics doctrine and influenced the design of dedicated aviation support vessels operated by the U.S. Navy through the Cold War. She was scrapped at Dalmuir in 1959. The concept she validated outlived her hull by decades. The Colossus class was the Royal Navy's answer to the need for mass carrier production under wartime industrial constraints. 10 ships were ordered in 1942 and 1943 designed to merchant navy construction standards rather than warship specifications. Commercially available fittings, simplified welded frames, standard machinery. The philosophy was explicit: build carriers quickly and cheaply enough to replace losses, accepting reduced combat survivability in exchange for production speed. The class provided the Royal Navy with the numerical carrier strength it had lacked throughout the war. HMS Ocean conducted the first landing of a jet aircraft on a carrier deck on December 3, 1945, when Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown landed a de Havilland Vampire, an event that redefined every subsequent carrier design requirement. HMS Triumph was present at the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, immediately deploying with Seafires and Fireflies, the only immediately available British carrier on the Far East Station. Several Colossus-class ships were sold to Allied navies: Venerable to the Netherlands, Vengeance to Australia, then Brazil, Warrior to Canada, then Argentina. The export program was both diplomatic and fiscal. The ships were surplus to peacetime requirements, and sales generated revenue for a treasury struggling with post-war debt. The Colossus class operated under the flags of 9 navies across 40 years. Their design longevity vindicated the rapid construction philosophy. The Majestic class represented an improved Colossus design. 6 hulls were ordered in 1943 and 1944. None of them ever commissioned into Royal Navy service. The end of the war in 1945 halted construction on all 6, and they sat on building ways and in fitting out basins across British yards while the Admiralty debated their future in a post-war defence budget that had contracted dramatically. HMCS Magnificent was completed and loaned to Canada in 1948. HMAS Melbourne, ex-Majestic, was completed to the new angled deck specification and commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy in 1955. Melbourne served the RAN until 1982. INS Vikrant, ex-Hercules, was completed by the Indian Navy at Belfast and commissioned in 1961, serving until 1997. Leviathan and Powerful remained incomplete in British yards for years, used as accommodation ships and harbour training vessels before being scrapped. The Majestic class is a case study in strategic miscalculation. 6 hulls built to meet a wartime requirement, then stranded by peace. The ships served other navies well for decades. The Royal Navy could not afford to use them itself. HMS Eagle was one of 2 Audacious class carriers, the largest carriers the Royal Navy ever completed. Laid down at Harland and Wolff, Belfast, in October 1942 and commissioned on March 1, 1951, Eagle represented the intended peak of British carrier aviation. She received a series of increasingly comprehensive modernizations: the angled flight deck in 1954, the steam catapult replacing the hydraulic system in 1955, and a full modernization between 1959 and 1964 that added a new bow section, 984 radar, and revised arresting gear capable of handling aircraft up to 50,000 pounds. The 1959 to 1964 refit cost £31 million, more than her original construction price, and delayed her return to service to a point where the Defence White Paper of 1966, which cancelled the CVA-01 programme and announced the phasing out of conventional carrier aviation by 1975, had already been issued. Eagle's modernisation had been completed just in time to be made irrelevant by a policy decision. She was reduced to the reserve in 1972 as HMS Ark Royal continued in service. Eagle was cannibalised for parts to keep Ark Royal operational, a process that stripped her hull of usable machinery and avionics before she was sold for scrapping at Cairnryan in 1978. She never fired a weapon in anger. The most capable British carrier to that point was destroyed by budget and policy, not enemy action. Her parts kept Ark Royal flying until 1978. Then both were gone. HMS Ark Royal was the second Audacious class hull and the last conventional fixed-wing fleet carrier the Royal Navy operated. Commissioned on February 25, 1955, she underwent the same pattern of progressive modernization as Eagle, receiving an angled deck, steam catapults, and eventually the modifications necessary to operate the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, the most capable fighter the Royal Navy had ever deployed. The F-4K required a £15,000 thrust boost from Rolls-Royce Spey engines to operate from Ark Royal's deck. No other Royal Navy carrier could operate them. Ark Royal's air group in her final commission included Phantom fighters, Blackburn Buccaneer strike aircraft, Fairey Gannet airborne early warning aircraft, and Sea King helicopters, a genuinely capable strike and defense package. The Gannets provided organic airborne early warning that no subsequent British carrier would possess until the Merlin Crow's Nest program entered service in 2021. The 1966 decision to phase out conventional carriers had condemned this capability to dissolution. Ark Royal was decommissioned on December 4, 1978. She was sold to Ward's shipbreakers at Cairn Ryan in 1980. 4 years later, Argentine aircraft with no Royal Navy Phantoms to stop them sank HMS Sheffield and Atlantic Conveyor in the South Atlantic. The connection was exact. The debate was over. The carriers were already gone. The Centaur class were ordered as enlarged light fleet carriers in 1944 and 1945. 4 hulls, Centaur, Albion, Bulwark, and Hermes, were completed between 1953 and 1961, each to a progressively more updated standard. HMS Centaur commissioned in 1953 as a conventional carrier with a straight deck. She was refitted with an angled deck in 1956 to 1958. HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark were both converted to commando carriers in the early 1960s, stripped of their conventional aviation fit and configured to carry 700 Royal Marines with supporting helicopters in the amphibious assault role. The commando carrier conversion was a pragmatic response to the 1966 carrier policy. Rather than scrap the hulls entirely, convert them to a role that the defence establishment was willing to fund. Bulwark and Albion provided amphibious capacity during confrontation operations in Borneo from 1963 to 1966, and withdrawal operations from Aden in 1967. HMS Hermes, the most modern of the 4, was completed to the fully angled deck, steam catapult standard in 1959 and underwent multiple modernizations. She served as flagship of the Falklands Task Force in 1982 under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, embarking Sea Harriers and Sea Kings. Her contribution was decisive. She was sold to India in 1986 as INS Virat and decommissioned in 2017 after 57 years of continuous service across 2 navies. CVA-01 was the Royal Navy's attempt to design a replacement for Eagle and Ark Royal, a 53,000-ton fleet carrier capable of operating a modern jet air group including Phantoms, Buccaneers, and airborne early warning aircraft. 2 ships were planned. Design work was advanced. Construction contracts were being prepared. The Defence Review of 1966, conducted under Dennis Healey as Secretary of State for Defence, cancelled both ships on February the 22nd, 1966, with the announcement that conventional carrier aviation would be phased out entirely by 1975. The argument for cancellation rested on 2 premises: that land-based aircraft could provide cover for operations outside the NATO area, and that the cost of CVA-01, at an estimated £56 million per ship, was unaffordable. Both premises were challenged at the time. The Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Sir David Luce, resigned in protest. The Navy's case that Britain's commitments east of Suez required organic air power was overruled by Treasury pressure. The Falklands War, 16 years later, demonstrated the cost of the decision with clarity that no strategic analysis had matched. The campaign proved exactly what Luce had argued, that land-based air cover cannot substitute for carrier air cover when operating beyond land-based range. CVA-01 would have been in service in 1982. The two ships were never laid down. Their absence cost 255 lives and £1.6 billion. The Invincible class entered service under a designation that the Navy invented specifically to avoid political confrontation. They were called through-deck cruisers during their design and procurement phase because the 1966 defense policy had cancelled carriers. The fiction was eventually abandoned. They were carriers, small ones, operating the BAE Sea Harrier via a 7-degree ski jump ramp developed by Lieutenant Commander Douglas Taylor in 1973, which increased payload and range by allowing the aircraft to launch at a lower speed and climb after leaving the deck. The Falklands War validated the class and the aircraft simultaneously. HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes deployed south with 28 Sea Harriers between them. The Sea Harriers flew 1,435 sorties, achieved 21 kills in air-to-air combat against 0 losses in air combat, and maintained a sortie rate that no expert had projected as achievable. The limitation of the class was unambiguous. 20,600 tons and 22 aircraft was insufficient for sustained fleet air defense or high-intensity strike operations. HMS Ark Royal, commissioned in 1985, was modified to operate the Harrier GR7 in a joint arrangement with the RAF. All three were decommissioned as the Queen Elizabeth class entered service. The class had sustained British carrier aviation through its most politically constrained period. HMS Ocean was the Royal Navy's first purpose-built helicopter carrier, a platform designed specifically for the landing platform helicopter role rather than converted from a conventional carrier. Built by Vickers at Barrow-in-Furness to commercial rather than warship standards, a deliberate cost reduction measure that reduced the build price to approximately £154 million against a warship standard equivalent of £300 million, she was commissioned on September 30th, 1998. The commercial construction standard generated controversy immediately. Her machinery was diesel rather than steam turbine, limiting speed to 18 knots. She lacked the damage resistance of a warship-grade hull. Critics argued the Admiralty had built a vessel that could not survive in a threat environment. Proponents pointed out that helicopter assault operations require sea control to be established before the ship is committed. Ocean deployed to the Gulf in 2003 for Operation Iraqi Freedom, inserting Royal Marines by helicopter in the Al-Faw Peninsula assault. She operated off Libya in 2011 during Operation Elemi, launching Apache helicopter gun runs against Gaddafi's forces, the first time British Army Air Corps Apaches had been deployed from a ship in a combat scenario. She was sold to Brazil in 2018 as NAE Atlantico. At 19 years, her service life was short for the investment made. HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales are the largest warships the Royal Navy has ever operated. 65,000 tons full load, 918 feet in length, with a flight deck of 4.5 acres. They took 36 years to go from concept to commission, absorbing every political reversal, budget crisis and procurement scandal the British defence establishment could generate. The Strategic Defence Review of 1998 first committed to the programme. The Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2010 temporarily cancelled the conventional catapult option and switched to the F-35BS TOVL variant, a decision that cost £100 million in redesign costs, before being partially reversed, then re-reversed, ultimately settling on STOVL with a 13-degree ski jump ramp. Queen Elizabeth commissioned on December 7th, 2017, 76 years to the day after Pearl Harbor. Her first operational deployment in 2021, Carrier Strike Group 21, covered 49,000 nautical miles and included 17 nations and 6 NATO allies, F-35Bs from 617 Squadron and US Marine Corps, 5 MFA 211 flew 4,700 sorties. The deployment demonstrated that the UK had rebuilt fleet carrier capability after a 39-year absence, the longest carrier gap in Royal Navy history. HMS Prince of Wales, commissioned on December 10th, 2019. Both ships use a twin island layout, separate islands for navigation and aviation control, derived from commercial ferry design practice and unique among modern carriers. The design decision eliminated the need to route aviation exhaust through a single combined island, improving both flight deck space and survivability. At 65,000 tons without nuclear propulsion, the class represents the largest non-nuclear carrier design in service anywhere in the world. Whether two ships are sufficient to provide continuous carrier availability is the question the program has never fully answered. The Royal Sovereign class established the template for the British pre-dreadnought and reset the terms of naval competition at the moment of their commissioning. Director of Naval Construction William White's design placed the four 13.5-inch guns in twin barbettes, fore and aft above the waterline, a departure from the low freeboard designs of the 1880s that gave the class exceptional seakeeping and firing arcs that previous ships could not match. At 14,150 tons, they were the largest and most powerful warships afloat when HMS Royal Sovereign commissioned on May 2nd, 1892. 7 ships were built, all commissioned between 1892 and 1894. Their construction accelerated after Parliament's Naval Defence Act of 1889 appropriated £21.5 million for 10 new battleships, the largest single naval appropriation in British history to that date. The programme signalled to France and Russia that Britain intended to maintain a 2-power standard, a fleet equal to any 2 other navies combined. None of the class saw fleet action. They served primarily in the Channel and Mediterranean fleets through the late 1890s and were progressively replaced by the Majestic and Canopus classes. All were sold for scrap or disposed of by 1913. Their significance was architectural. They set the design standard that 6 subsequent pre-dreadnought classes would refine over the following 14 years, each iteration adding tonnage, armour and gun calibre to the formula White had established. The Majestic class was the largest single battleship class Britain ever built, 9 ships commissioned between 1895 and 1898, forming the numerical backbone of the Royal Navy through the turn of the century. The shift from 13.5-inch to 12-inch main armament reflected the adoption of the new Mark 8 gun, whose higher muzzle velocity and improved metallurgy delivered equivalent destructive effect from a smaller, lighter weapon, enabling the class to carry heavier secondary and tertiary batteries within the same displacement envelope. All 9 ships served in the Mediterranean and Channel fleets during the South African War period, representing British naval power at its institutional peak. By 1914, however, the Majestic class was already obsolescent, replaced by 4 successive classes of dreadnoughts and rendered strategically irrelevant by the shift in naval architecture that HMS Dreadnought had forced. World War I assigned most surviving Majestics to the Dardanelles campaign. HMS Majestic herself was torpedoed by German submarine U-21 on May 27, 1915 off Cape Helles, capsizing with the loss of 49 men. The class that had defined British naval power in 1895 finished its career as expendable blockade assets in 1915, a trajectory that measured the pace of technological change in naval warfare. The Canopus class represented a deliberate reduction in displacement to produce ships capable of operating in shallow draft, colonial waters. At 13,150 tons against the Majestic's 14,890, the Canopus class traded displacement for speed and the ability to transit the Suez Canal fully loaded, a strategic requirement driven by Admiralty assessments of Russian and French naval expansion in the Far East. The 6 ships commissioned between 1900 and 1902 served primarily in the Mediterranean and China station before World War I. HMS Canopus participated in the hunt for Admiral von Spee's East Asiatic Squadron in 1914, reaching the Falkland Islands before the main British force. Her presence may have delayed von Spee's departure long enough for the battlecruisers HMS Invincible and Inflexible to arrive and destroy his squadron on December 8, 1914. HMS Goliath was torpedoed in the Dardanelles on May the 12th and 13th, 1915 by the Ottoman destroyer Muavenet-i-Millia, capsizing with the loss of 570 men. The sinking demonstrated that pre-dreadnought battleships deployed in confined waters against torpedo craft were not warships, but targets. The lesson was not sufficiently acted upon before the loss of other pre-dreadnoughts followed. The formidable class was a reversion to full-size battleship displacement after the reduced Canopus design, incorporating thicker side armour over a greater waterline length. Director of Naval Construction. White specified Harvey's cemented armour on a nickel-steel backing plate, a combination that resisted penetration better than the compound armour of the preceding decade, at a weight penalty acceptable within the 15,000-ton displacement. 3 ships commissioned between 1901 and 1902. HMS Formidable was torpedoed by U-24 on January 1, 1915 in the English Channel while conducting exercises, the first British dreadnought lost in the war. She sank in 90 minutes with 547 men. HMS Irresistible was mined and then torpedoed during the naval assault on the Dardanelles on March 18, 1915, sinking with significant casualties. Her sister, HMS Implacable, survived the war and was used as a training hulk before being scuttled in 1921. The formidable class exemplified the pre-dreadnought's wartime fate. Too obsolete for fleet action, too valuable to waste, too vulnerable to the weapons that modern naval warfare had produced. The London class was a near repeat of the formidable design with minor internal improvements to crew accommodation and fire control arrangements. 5 ships commissioned between 1902 and 1904. Their construction coincided with the first serious analysis of the all-big-gun battleship concept by Admiral John Fisher, whose advocacy would produce HMS Dreadnought 3 years after the last London-class ship commissioned. HMS Bulwark was destroyed by an internal magazine explosion at Sheerness on November 26, 1914, killing 736 of her 750 crew. The catastrophic loss was attributed to improper cordite stowage, a lesson that the Royal Navy would fail to fully absorb until the Battle of Jutland in 1916, when similar magazine explosions destroyed the battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible. The surviving London-class ships served as second-line fleet units throughout the war, employed in the Dardanelles and as harbour guard ships. The London-class produced no distinguished operational record. Their significance was numerical. They represented the last major pre-dreadnought class before Fisher's Revolution consumed the building programme. The King Edward VII class introduced the intermediate calibre secondary battery, 4 9.2-inch guns in addition to the main 12-inch armament, intended to increase broadside weight against vessels too large for 6-inch guns, but too agile for deliberate 12-inch salvos. 8 ships commissioned between 1905 and 1907, making it the largest class of pre-dreadnoughts ever completed for the Royal Navy. HMS Dreadnought made them conceptually obsolete before the last of the class was commissioned. The intermediate battery philosophy they embodied was immediately abandoned in favour of the all-big-gun principle. The King Edward VII class ships were described by Fisher as the wobblers. His contemptuous assessment of the compromise they represented between the old mixed battery approach and the all-big-gun logic he had championed. HMS King. Edward VII was mined and sank on January 6, 1916, with no loss of life in the explosion, but significant casualties during the evacuation. HMS Britannia was torpedoed by German submarine UB-50 on November 9, 1918, 2 days before the armistice, while entering the Strait of Gibraltar, sinking with the loss of 50 men. She was one of the last British warships sunk in the war, and among the last to die as an operationally meaningful fighting ship of the pre-dreadnought era. The Lord Nelson class was the ultimate expression of the pre-dreadnought battleship, the final refinement of the formula before HMS Dreadnought rendered it permanently obsolete. Director of Naval Construction Philip Watts designed these 2 ships with the most powerful secondary battery yet fitted to a British battleship. 10 9.2-inch guns arranged to provide 6-gun broadsides on each beam. HMS Lord Nelson and HMS Agamemnon were laid down in 1905 and 1906, respectively, but their construction was deliberately delayed to allow the revolutionary dreadnought to complete first, a decision that exposed the obsolescence of their design before they had even been launched. They commissioned in 1908 into a navy that was already building their replacements. Both ships served in the Dardanelles campaign in 1915, providing offshore bombardment support during the naval assault and the subsequent Gallipoli landings. Both survived the war without major damage, a combination of their heavy protection and their deployment in support, rather than fleet roles. They were sold for scrapping in 1920 and 1921. The last pre-dreadnoughts to be built, they were among the last to serve. HMS Dreadnought was not the inevitable product of naval evolution. She was the result of one man's conviction that the existing paradigm was wrong and his authority to act on that conviction without waiting for consensus. Admiral Sir John Fisher became First Sea Lord in October 1904, and within 6 months had assembled a committee on designs that produced the specification for a battleship armed entirely with heavy guns, 10 12-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. Parsons' turbines gave her 21 knots, 3 knots faster than any contemporary battleship. The keel was laid on October 2nd, 1905. She floated on February 10th, 1906, having been built in 366 days from laying down to launch. She commissioned on December 11th, 1906. From that date, every battleship in existence was obsolete, and every battleship under construction required reassessment. The strategic paradox Fisher created was recognized immediately. Britain had superior capital ship strength and had voluntarily destroyed the value of that superiority by introducing a new class that reset the competition to zero. Fisher's response was that Britain's industrial capacity would outbuild everyone. He was largely correct. Dreadnought herself never fired her guns in anger and was sold for scrap in 1921. She had already done her work simply by existing. The Bellerophon class was a near repetition of Dreadnought with modifications drawn directly from sea trials, improved subdivision below the waterline and a repositioned forecastle mast that eliminated the problem of funnel gases obscuring the foretop fire control position. 3 ships commissioned in 1909. They demonstrated that the Royal Navy intended to build the type in series rather than wait for a further design iteration. All 3 served in the Grand Fleet at Jutland on May 31st and June 1st, 1916. HMS Bellerophon fired 67 rounds of 12-inch ammunition. HMS Superb fired 54 rounds. HMS Temeraire fired 36 rounds. None was hit by German heavy shells. The Bellerophon class participated in the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet on November 21, 1918, forming part of the Grand Fleet Escort that received 74 German warships in the Firth of Forth. 3 weeks later, all 3 were relegated to reserve status. They were sold for scrapping under the Washington Naval Treaty provisions of 1921 and 1922. The St. Vincent class introduced the 12-inch 50 caliber gun, a longer barrel providing higher muzzle velocity and improved armor penetration at the ranges that naval tacticians were beginning to consider as battle might actually be fought. 3 ships commissioned between 1910 and 1911. The progression from Dreadnought through Bellerophon to St. Vincent illustrated the systematic improvement philosophy that characterized British naval construction, incremental gains compounding across successive classes. All 3 served in the Grand Fleet at Jutland. HMS Collingwood fired 84 rounds of 12-inch shells. HMS St. Vincent fired 98. Neither suffered significant damage, but HMS Vanguard never fired at an enemy. On July 9, 1917, she was destroyed at anchor in Scapa Flow by an internal magazine explosion, killing all but 2 of her 845-man crew. The explosion was attributed to overheated cordite, the same mechanism responsible for the loss of HMS Bulwark in 1914 and the battlecruiser losses at Jutland. HMS Vanguard remains at the bottom of Scapa Flow, a war grave holding the bodies of 843 men. HMS Neptune introduced the super-firing turret arrangement to British battleships, placing the midships turret in a raised position forward of the aft pair, allowing all 10 12-inch guns to fire on the broadside simultaneously for the first time in British Dreadnought design. Previous Dreadnoughts had been unable to use all turrets in broadside fire because amidships wing turrets obstructed each other's arcs. The Colossus class, comprising HMS Colossus and HMS Hercules, was essentially a repeat of Neptune with detail improvements. All 3 ships served at Jutland. Neptune fired 48 rounds. Colossus was the only Dreadnought battleship at Jutland to receive 12-inch shell hits, sustaining 2 near misses that caused minor flooding. Hercules fired 93 rounds. All three were placed in reserve after the armistice and sold for scrap under the Washington Naval Treaty in 1921 and 1922. They served as the transition between the early dreadnought concept and the King George V class that immediately followed, ships that solved the superfiring problem completely and introduced the 13.5-inch gun that defined the super dreadnought era. The Orion class marked the transition from dreadnought to super dreadnought by adopting the 13.5-inch gun in a completely centerline layout. All 5 twin turrets on the ship's centerline in superfiring pairs with no wing turrets to obstruct broadside arcs. The result was a full 10-gun broadside for the first time in British capital ship history. The 13.5-inch Mark V gun fired a 1,250-pound shell compared to the 12-inch gun's 850-pound shell, a 47% increase in projectile weight. 4 ships commissioned between 1912 and 1913. HMS Thunderer won the fleet gunnery competition in November 1911 before commissioning, demonstrating performance standards that exceeded those of any previous British battleship. All 4 served at Jutland. HMS Conqueror, Orion, and Monarch each fired 57 rounds of 13.5-inch. HMS Thunderer fired 29. None suffered significant damage. Under the Washington Naval Treaty, all 4 were sold for scrapping in 1922 and 1923. The treaty that ended the naval arms race also eliminated ships that were, in 1922, still among the most powerful in the world. Political economics destroyed what German gunnery had not. The 1912 King George V class was an improved Orion incorporating thicker side armour and revised internal subdivision. The 4 ships commissioned in 1912 and 1913. Their construction coincided with Winston Churchill's first naval estimates as First Lord of the Admiralty, a document committing Britain to maintaining a 60% superiority over German dreadnought strength. HMS Audacious was mined on October 27, 1914 off the north coast of Ireland, sinking after a prolonged salvage attempt that failed when the stern exploded. She was the first British dreadnought lost in the war. The Admiralty suppressed news of her loss until after the armistice, fearing the propaganda effect on neutral opinion, particularly in the United States. The remaining 3 ships served at Jutland. HMS Ajax fired 56 rounds of 13.5-inch. HMS Centurion fired 53. HMS King George V fired 11 rounds before a temporary gun malfunction interrupted her firing. Centurion was later converted to a radio-controlled target ship and served until 1944, when she was sunk as part of the Mulberry Harbour breakwater off Normandy, an end entirely different from the fleet action the Admiralty had built her to fight. The Iron Duke class was the final development of the 13.5-inch gun Super Dreadnought and the class that commanded the Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. HMS Iron Duke served as flagship for Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, the man Churchill described as the only person who could lose the war in an afternoon. On May 31, 1916, Iron Duke led 24 British dreadnoughts and battlecruisers against the German High Seas Fleet in the largest naval battle in history. She fired 90 rounds of 13.5-inch shells and was hit twice by 12-inch shells, suffering minor damage. HMS Marlborough was torpedoed during the battle, striking her starboard side with a single hit that caused significant flooding. She maintained station and continued fighting, firing 162 rounds of 13.5-inch before withdrawing. All 4 Iron Duke-class ships survived Jutland. The 12 times 6-inch secondary battery, replacing the earlier 4-inch quick-firers, was intended to defeat torpedo boat destroyers at the ranges that fleet actions would actually produce. Iron Duke herself survived both World Wars, serving as a harbour training ship in the second, before being sold for scrap in 1946. She had outlasted everything around her by maintaining relevance through institutional adaptation rather than fighting capability. The Queen Elizabeth class was the finest battleship design produced by any navy in the First World War. 5 ships that combined 25 knot speed, 8 15-inch guns, and oil-fired boilers into a package that dominated both world wars across a 30-year operational career. The 15-inch Mark I gun fired a 1,920-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,450 feet per second, 54% more shell weight than the 13.5-inch. And proved so reliable and accurate that the same basic weapon equipped every major British battleship through to HMS Vanguard in 1946. HMS Warspite fought at Jutland, sustaining 13 hits from German 12-inch and 11-inch shells that caused severe damage and temporary loss of steering control. Yet she remained in action, fired 259 rounds of 15-inch, and survived to fight again in World War II, where she was present at Narvik, Calabria, Matapan, and the Normandy bombardment. No ship in the Royal Navy accumulated a comparable combat record. HMS Barham was torpedoed by German submarine U-331 on November 25, 1941, in the Mediterranean, capsizing and sinking in approximately 4 minutes after her magazines exploded. 862 men were killed, 450 survived. The 5 Queen Elizabeth-class ships were the most consequential British battleships of the 20th century, demonstrating that a design could be relevant across 2 world wars if the initial conception was sufficiently advanced. The 1916 Royal Sovereign class, the R-class, was built concurrently with the Queen Elizabeths, but incorporated coal and oil mixed firing rather than pure oil propulsion, reducing their speed to 23 knots against the Queen Elizabeth's 25. The 2-knot disadvantage, which seemed minor in 1913, proved decisive in the interwar period. The R-class ships were too slow to serve with the fast carrier task forces that World War II demanded, relegating them to convoy, escort, and subsidiary bombardment roles. HMS Royal Oak was torpedoed in Scapa Flow by German submarine U-47 under Kapitänleutnant Günther Prien on October 14, 1939, a feat of navigation through the defended anchorage that shocked the Royal Navy. She sank in 13 minutes with the loss of 833 men. The attack demonstrated that Scapa Flow's defences had not been maintained to a standard that resisted 1939 submarine technology. HMS Ramillies survived the war, having participated in the hunt for the Bismarck, the bombardment of Diego Suarez in 1942, and the Normandy landings in 1944. All 5 were sold for scrapping in the late 1940s, their wartime service record reflecting the limitations their designers had accepted in 1913. The Nelson class was the product of the Washington Naval Treaty's constraint, 35,000-ton standard displacement applied by British designers who refused to accept that constraint required inferior ships. Director of Naval Construction Stanley Goodall concentrated all 9 16-inch guns forward in 3 triple turrets, positioned the machinery spaces aft, and achieved a combination of firepower, armour protection, and anti-torpedo defence that no previous British battleship had matched within any displacement limit. The 16-inch Mark I gun fired a 2,048-pound shell, the heaviest shell ever mounted in a British warship. The armour belt reached 14 inches at the waterline, thicker than any previous British battleship. HMS Rodney participated in the destruction of the Bismarck on May 27, 1941, firing 380 16-inch shells and multiple torpedo hits at close range. HMS Nelson was mined twice, torpedoed once, survived, and continued in service through the Italian armistice in 1943 and the Normandy bombardment in 1944. Both were sold for scrapping in 1948 and 1949. The 1940 King George V class was compromised before the first ship was laid down by a treaty deadline the Admiralty chose to meet rather than miss. Britain had declared she would not exceed 14-inch guns under the 1936 Second London Naval Treaty, then discovered that Japan was building 18-inch gunned Yamato-class ships in secret. The decision to proceed with 14-inch guns rather than delay for a redesign was political, meeting the treaty obligation that Germany, Japan, and the United States were ignoring. HMS Prince of Wales was sunk on December 10, 1941 by Japanese aircraft from the 22nd Air Flotilla, northeast of Malaya, along with the battle cruiser HMS Repulse. Both ships lacked air cover. Prince of Wales absorbed 6 aerial torpedo hits and 1 bomb before capsizing, killing 327 men. The sinking provided the final proof that battleships operating without air cover against modern land-based air power were non-survivable. HMS Duke of York sank the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst at the Battle of North Cape on December 26, 1943, hitting her 13 times with 14-inch shells in a night engagement. It was the last classic battleship action fought by the Royal Navy. All surviving units were sold for scrap between 1957 and 1958. HMS Hood was the largest warship in the world for 20 years, a battle cruiser completed in 1920 that combined 15-inch guns with 31-knot speed in a 42,670-ton hull that impressed every navy that saw her. She symbolized British naval power between the wars to a degree that no other ship matched. She was simultaneously the Navy's most beautiful ship and its most dangerous design, Gamble, a battlecruiser optimized for speed by reducing the deck armor that would have protected her against plunging fire at long range. A 1919 Admiralty reconstruction study recommended adding 5,000 tons of additional armor. The modification was never carried out, partly due to cost, and partly due to the belief that post-Jutland tactical doctrine would prevent long-range plunging fire engagements. That belief was 20 years out of date when Hood engaged the Bismarck. On May 24, 1941, the 5th salvo fired by Bismarck struck Hood's after magazine. She sank in approximately 3 minutes. Of her 1,418 crew, 1,415 died. 3 men were recovered from the North Atlantic. Hood's symbolic importance had exceeded her military capability for years. The gap between symbol and reality closed at 6 o'clock on May 24, 1941, in the Denmark Strait in a flash of light that was visible 40 miles away. HMS Vanguard was the last battleship ever built by any Western Navy, completed in 1946. Too late to fight the war she had been designed for, too expensive to maintain in the economic crisis that followed it, and too large to serve any strategic purpose that aircraft carriers and missiles had not already assumed. She mounted the 15-inch guns removed from the battlecruisers, glorious and courageous in the 1920s, weapons already a quarter-century old when fitted. She was the finest battleship Britain ever built in pure technical terms. The most stable gun platform, the most comprehensively anti-aircraft equipped, the fastest large battleship in Royal Navy service, and the best protected. At 44,500 tons full load, she was also the largest British warship ever built at that point. None of it mattered operationally. She commissioned into a navy that was decommissioning battleships, not planning to use them. She carried the royal family to South Africa in 1947 for a state visit, the most significant deployment of her career. Vanguard was decommissioned in 1960 and sold for scrapping at Faslane, the last act of a naval tradition that had defined global power for 2 centuries. The era was over. What replaced it was not less powerful, it was differently powerful. Vanguard's scrapping closed the account of a technology that had begun in iron, survived into steel, and finally fell not to an enemy, but to arithmetic. The Lion-class was the Royal Navy's response to the failure of the 14-inch gun decision that had constrained the King George V class, 4 battleships designed from 1938 with 16-inch guns, 30 knots, and the full protection that the KGV class had sacrificed to treaty limits. They were to have been the most powerful battleships Britain ever built. Contracts were placed in August 1939 for HMS Lion and HMS Temeraire. The outbreak of war immediately diverted steel, skilled labour, and shipyard capacity toward more urgently needed destroyers, corvettes, and submarines. In October 1940, the programme was suspended with Lion's hull at 45% completion. Temeraire, Conqueror, and Thunderer were cancelled before significant construction had proceeded. The decision to cancel them was not wrong. The steel and labour went to the Atlantic battle that actually decided the war, but the ships they would have been were among the finest battleship designs in naval history. What their combat record would have been, no one can know. Commissioned in October 1893, HMS Havoc and her sister Hornet birthed an entirely new breed of warship, the torpedo boat destroyer. Developed not for power projection but as a desperate defence against swarms of fast torpedo boats, these radical 240-ton vessels clocked a staggering 27 knots on trials, making them the fastest warships afloat. Yet, behind the impressive speed lay a fragile reality. They were essentially racing yachts stuffed with weapons, structurally delicate and hazardous in heavy seas. Their coal-fired steam plants, pushed to absolute design limits, suffered constant mechanical failures. While they achieved their legendary 27 knots in calm trials, that speed proved purely academic in the brutal winter waves of the North Sea. Despite these flaws, the Admiralty ordered 42 of these 27 knotters from various commercial shipbuilders. This decision established a highly competitive, multi-yard procurement strategy that defined British naval construction for the next century. It successfully maintained vital industrial capacity and accelerated technical improvements through builder rivalry. However, it came at a logistical cost, a messy lack of standardized equipment across nominally identical ships, an operational burden the Navy would carry through every single destroyer program for many decades to come down the line. The pursuit of raw velocity led directly to the 30-knotter class. 66 of these vessels were built between 1896 and 1901, attempting to improve upon earlier designs by demanding higher sustained speed. However, reaching 30 knots required high-pressure boilers and complex machinery, which drastically increased mechanical failure rates while providing only marginal gains in seakeeping. Realizing this limitation, naval architects radically shifted gears with the landmark River class. 34 of these ships entered service between 1903 and 1905, fundamentally redefining the concept. Designers courageously accepted a lower speed of 25.5 knots. In exchange, they built a robust 570-ton vessel capable of weathering open ocean storms. Crucially, this class dropped the title of torpedo boat destroyer to become officially known simply as destroyers, signaling their evolution into independent warships with offensive capabilities. When World War I erupted, these reliable vessels proved indispensable for arduous patrol and convoy escort duties. The River class demonstrated that sacrificing top-end speed for survival and seakeeping was the correct operational choice. It was a vital lesson in naval architecture that the Admiralty would forget and relearn multiple times over the coming century of global conflict. By 1905, the Admiralty succumbed once more to the obsession with absolute speed, ordering 12 vessels of the radical tribal class. Displacing 1,100 tons, these massive warships sacrificed almost every practical quality to achieve an astonishing 33 knots during trials. In active service, however, they proved wildly expensive and mechanically fragile, demonstrating that prioritizing high speed above all else produced vessels excellent for breaking records but poorly suited for actual warfare. Recognizing this misstep, the Navy executed a corrective course with the Beagle class of 1909 and the Acorn class of 1911. Designers reduced top speeds to implement reliable, manageable mechanical plants while upgrading the main armament to the formidable 4-inch gun. Displacing 772 tons, the Acorn class represented a beautifully balanced design that prioritized ocean-going ruggedness over experimental velocity. In the tense decade leading to the First World War, British shipyards fabricated these standardized pre-war destroyers at a blistering pace of 20 or more per year. This massive multi-yard output successfully secured the vast numerical superiority dictated by Admiralty doctrine, ensuring the fleet had enough hulls for critical North Sea escort duties, torpedo attacks, and anti-submarine patrols across hostile waters. The iconic V and W classes represented the definitive culmination of British destroyer development during the crucible of the First World War. 67 of these vessels entered service between 1917 and 1923, integrating 4 brutal years of hard-fought combat lessons, displacing 1,490 tons, armed with 4 4-inch guns and 6 torpedo tubes on a swift 34-knot hull. They were the mature expression of fleet warfare. Yet, their finest hour came decades later. At the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the surviving ships underwent a radical transformation into long-range escorts. Engineers stripped away heavy surface weaponry, reduced torpedo tubes, and packed the hulls with advanced anti-submarine weapons and extended fuel tanks. This conversion turned aging fleet fighters into specialized hunters for the perilous Battle of the Atlantic, proving that an adaptable hull could find new life in a completely different conflict. HMS Verdun exemplified this durability, remaining in active service until 1946. Across 28 years of operational deployment, the V and W classes proved that well-built destroyers of adequate displacement possessed incredible lifespans, surviving far beyond the specific tactical environments they were originally engineered to endure by their creators in the early days of design. In 1930, the Royal Navy inaugurated a bold new chapter with the A and B classes, launching a standardized lineage of interwar lettered destroyers. Comprising 8 ships each, these sleek vessels established a baseline blueprint for a decade of naval construction. 1,350 tons displacement, 4 formidable 4.7-inch guns, 8 lethal torpedo tubes, and a fleet-footed top speed of 35 knots. Built for intense fleet engagements, they were destined to face the ultimate test under fire. On June 8, 1940, HMS Ardent found herself hopelessly outgunned, trapped by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. In a display of raw defiance that came to define the destroyer ethos, Ardent aggressively charged the capital ships, firing her guns until she was completely obliterated and swallowed by the sea. This desperate heroism carried a catastrophic price tag. Of the 16 built in the A and B classes, 9 were sunk in combat, a staggering 56% attrition rate. This devastating loss ratio reflected both the unrelenting intensity of naval operations in 1940 and the fundamental vulnerability of lightly armoured destroyer hulls when facing modern enemy aviation and heavy naval artillery on the open ocean during these early war years. The evolution continued with the C and D classes. Commissioned between 1931 and 1933, these 16 ships brought subtle upgrades to the lettered formula, pushing displacement to 1,375 tons, while introducing superior fire control systems and improved mechanical reliability. Peacetime engineering soon gave way to legendary wartime exploits. On February 16, 1940, HMS Cossack secured immortality. Defying international law, Captain Philip Vian steered Cossack straight into neutral Norwegian territorial waters to board the German supply vessel Altmark. Storming the ship, the boarding party liberated 299 captive British merchant sailors, shouting the phrase that electrified a besieged nation, "The Navy's here." Yet, the brutal nature of destroyer service remained inescapable. Just 2 days later, sister ship HMS Daring was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat, highlighting the thin line between triumph and tragedy. Ultimately, the C and D classes demonstrated that the interwar design formula produced highly capable peacetime vessels and adequate wartime tools. In the lethal arenas of World War II, adequate meant just one thing: surviving long enough to execute the mission successfully before being blown out of the water by an aggressive enemy force that completely outmatched them. As the shadow of global war lengthened, the E, F, G, and H classes maintained the reliable lettered formula while introducing pivotal adjustments. Built between 1934 and 1937, the later G and H iterations experimented with a 5th main gun and enhanced anti-aircraft weaponry, signaling the Admiralty's growing anxiety over hostile air power. But it was a standard destroyer of this group that performed one of the most astonishing acts of naval bravery ever recorded. On April 8, 1940, HMS Glowworm was isolated and heavily damaged by German destroyers. Crippled and facing certain destruction, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roop made a breathtaking decision. He ordered Glowworm to ram the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a 14,000-ton Leviathan, against a mere 1,345-ton destroyer. glowworm tore a massive 40-metre gash in the cruiser's steel hull before exploding. Roop was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, uniquely recommended by the Hipper's own captain. Despite such legendary gallantry, courage could not alter the grim math of attrition. These four classes suffered 50% combat losses across World War II, decimated primarily in the Mediterranean during 1941 and 1942, where total Luftwaffe air superiority turned destroyer operations into virtual suicide runs for the crews involved. By 1937, a fierce ideological schism split British destroyer design, giving birth to the standard I class and the radical tribal class. The tribals were heavy, 1,870-ton beasts armed with 8 lethal 4.7-inch guns in 4 twin mounts. To accommodate this massive firepower, designers halved their torpedo capability, igniting a fiery debate between gunnery enthusiasts and torpedo traditionalists. Meanwhile, the J-class successor yielded the war's most famous destroyer, HMS Kelly. Commanded by the legendary Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten, Kelly personified the fleet's aggressive spirit until German dive bombers tragically sent her to the bottom off Crete on May 23, 1941. The tribals met an equally brutal fate. Deployed as frontline shock troops, 12 of the 16 ships were destroyed in combat. A shattering 75% attrition rate, the highest of any British destroyer class in World War II. They were pushed to the absolute limit and paid a horrifying price in blood and steel. The 4 battle-scarred tribals that survived the global conflagration were transferred to Commonwealth navies, where their robust hulls continued to serve with honour deep into the 1960s, a true testament to their exceptionally rugged and enduring basic design. As Europe stood on the precipice of total war, the J, K and N classes brought heavy firepower back to the destroyer fleet. Comprising 8 ships per class, these formidable 1,760-ton vessels were substantially larger than their interwar predecessors. They introduced advanced twin 4.7-inch gun mountings, raising their main battery to 6 devastating barrels while simultaneously maintaining a lethal payload of 10 torpedo tubes. They were heavily armed and ready for action, but no engineering could protect them from the paradigm shift occurring in the skies above. In May 1941, the K-class sailed into the meat grinder of the Battle of Crete. Within days, relentless German dive bombers annihilated 5 of the 8 sister ships. HMS Kashmir and HMS Kelly were blown apart and sent to the bottom, leaving only HMS Kipling to make a desperate escape, packed with shell-shocked survivors. The catastrophic losses off Crete delivered a definitive, bloody lesson to the Admiralty. Destroyers operating without localized air cover against coordinated, intensive dive bomber attacks suffered a brutal slaughter that no tactical doctrine or crew bravery could possibly mitigate under modern combat conditions at sea. The era of unchecked surface fleet supremacy was officially over. By 1941, the relentless onslaught of air power forced a dramatic evolutionary leap in the wartime alphabet program, manifesting in the L and M classes. Commissioned between 1941 and 1942, these 16 warships introduced the most significant armament revision of the war, replacing the traditional 4.7-inch surface guns with innovative 4-inch QF high-angle/low-angle mountings. Capable of an astonishing 80-degree elevation, these guns were genuinely effective in the anti-aircraft role. This hardware upgrade coincided with the widespread deployment of advanced radar-directed anti-aircraft fire control systems, Consequently, the L and M class destroyers served with distinction in the highly contested airspaces of the later war years, proving far more resilient and survivable than their predecessors. Their service did not end with the Allied victory in 1945. In the post-war era, the Admiralties sold these battle-tested vessels to the emerging navies of India, Pakistan, and Burma. This established a critical pattern of Commonwealth destroyer transfers that sustained global Allied naval capabilities throughout the tense early decades of the Cold War, ensuring these legendary hulls continued patrolling international shipping lanes well into the 1960s. They stood as a bulwark for peace across a rapidly changing maritime landscape worldwide. Faced with catastrophic combat losses, the Admiralty unleashed the industrial peak of British wartime shipbuilding, the Emergency Destroyer Programme. Between 1942 and 1944, an astonishing 64 destroyers spanning the O through W classes were rapidly commissioned. The Navy realised that meticulous pre-war procurement was wholly inadequate for total war. The solution was ruthless standardization. Built simultaneously across dozens of commercial shipyards, these emergency vessels averaged a mere 12 months from keel laying to full deployment. Architects intentionally chose a highly conservative design strategy, utilizing strictly proven machinery and existing weapon systems while completely banning experimental technology. Innovation slowed assembly lines, and raw numbers were the ultimate operational priority. This industrial gamble paid off handsomely. These workhorses flooded the fleet and fought in every single major campaign and theatre of the war's second half. They braved ice and U-boats on the grueling Arctic convoys to Russia, protected critical lifelines in the North Atlantic, and spearheaded massive amphibious landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. From the bloody beaches of D-Day to the sprawling Pacific campaigns against Imperial Japan, the emergency destroyers formed the unbreakable backbone of Allied naval victory. They were exactly what Britain needed. Entering service in the final chapters of the global conflict, the Z-class and subsequent CA through CR groups represented a bridge to the future of British naval warfare. Comprising 40 sophisticated warships commissioned between 1944 and 1946, these vessels introduced the formidable 4.5-inch QF Mark IV gun. This advanced weapon system revolutionized destroyer tactics, replacing the aging 4.7-inch guns that had defined the interwar fleet and establishing a main armament standard that would endure for 30 years. For many of these sleek warships, the ultimate trial of combat never came. Completed too late to join the European theatre, they commissioned after the German surrender, with eyes fixed on a massive deployment to the Pacific. However, the atomic bombings and Japan's sudden surrender in August 1945 abruptly ended their wartime prospects. Instead, these hulls became the versatile workhorses of the post-war fleet, with several CE Group ships undergoing extensive modernization and conversion. The long-lived 4.5-inch main battery they pioneered would continue to roar in Royal Navy service through the County class and straight into the Type 42 Sheffield era, outlasting the very ships they were designed to arm. Their longevity testified to excellent British engineering craft. Emerging into the dawn of the Cold War, the battle and weapon classes reflected a frantic effort to integrate the brutal air defense lessons of World War II. Comprising 26 vessels completed between 1943 and 1946, the massive 2,315-ton battle class stood as the largest British destroyers of their generation. Engineered from the keel up as fully balanced fleet defenders, they packed 4 heavy 4.5-inch guns, a dense battery of 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft cannons, and 10 lethal torpedo tubes into a formidable battle-ready frame. In sharp contrast, the ill-fated weapon class attempted a radical step forward. Designed to carry a highly experimental twin 4-inch dual-purpose mount, theoretically superior in both surface and anti-aircraft engagements, the design proved hopelessly temperamental. Plagued by constant mechanical failures, production was abruptly halted after just 4 hulls were completed. As the British Empire rapidly contracted, the fiscal reality of the post-war era made maintaining a massive domestic fleet impossible. Consequently, the Admiralty sold numerous battle-class ships to Australia, Canada, Pakistan, and India. This fire sale satisfied the urgent defence needs of Commonwealth allies while desperately reducing the heavy financial burden on a nearly bankrupt British treasury. The geopolitical map was shifting fast. Commissioned between 1952 and 1954, the 8 ships of the magnificent Daring class represented the absolute pinnacle and the final gasp of the classic gun-armed destroyer. Displacing 2,800 tons, these mechanical masterpieces boasted 6 4.5-inch guns housed in 3 fully automatic twin mountings, 10 heavy torpedo tubes, and a radar-guided fire control system that stood as the absolute culmination of 60 years of British naval gunnery development. They were the finest conventional destroyers ever built, engineered to dominate a threat landscape of Soviet surface raiders, piston-engine aircraft, and traditional submarines. Yet, history moved faster than the shipyards. By the mid-1950s, the sudden arrival of anti-ship guided missiles and tactical nuclear weapons rendered heavy artillery and unguided torpedoes profoundly obsolete. Despite their immense capabilities, the entire class was retired prematurely between 1969 and 1971. 2 found a second life with Peru, serving faithfully into the 1990s. The Daring class marked the definitive endpoint of a proud, continuous evolutionary bloodline that began with HMS Havoc in 1893. From this moment onward, the gun was completely dethroned, and the terrifying era of the guided missile had arrived to reshape naval warfare forever across the globe. In 1962, the Royal Navy boldly stepped into the missile age with the revolutionary County class. Comprising 8 massive warships commissioned through 1970, these behemoths displaced 5,440 tons, nearly double the size of the Daring class they replaced. In lieu of traditional torpedo tubes, they wielded the high-tech Sea Slug surface-to-air missile system, purpose-built for Cold War fleet air defense against high-altitude Soviet bombers. But the system possessed a fatal flaw. The Sea Slug GWS-1 was a beam-riding missile crippled by severely limited tracking performance against low-flying targets. This precise blind spot was exploited ruthlessly by the Argentine Air Force in the Falklands War. On June 12, 1982, HMS Glamorgan was struck by a shore-launched Exocet missile that skimmed just above the waves. The impact killed 13 brave crewmen and incinerated her helicopter hangar. Between 1982 and 1987, 4 of these aging warships were sold to Chile. Designed to challenge superpowers in global maritime arenas, they spent their final operational years patrolling South American coastlines. This stark contrast between intended role and actual employment perfectly characterized the agonizing compromises of post-war British naval defense planning at that historic juncture. The changing world demanded total flexibility. The Type 42 Sheffield class was a desperate byproduct of severe economic austerity. Built between 1975 and 1985, these 14 destroyers were tasked with providing critical area air defense for carrier battle groups, but their design was aggressively compromised by rigid budget caps. Armed with a twin Sea Dart missile launcher carrying 40 rounds and a single 4.5-inch gun, they lacked any close-in weapon system to intercept sea-skimming threats. In 1982, this fiscal compromise extracted a horrifying payment in blood. On May 4th, an Argentine Exocet missile blindsided HMS Sheffield, dealing a fatal blow. Weeks later, on May 25th, HMS Coventry was struck and sunk by 3 1,000-pound bombs dropped by low-flying aircraft that slipped entirely beneath the Sea Dart's minimum engagement altitude. Meanwhile, HMS Glasgow narrowly escaped destruction when an enemy bomb pierced her hull without detonating. 3 Type 42s hit in just 3 weeks proved that the design's defensive umbrella possessed a catastrophic blind spot. The ships were systematically retired between 2009 and 2013. The final vessel, HMS Edinburgh, decommissioned in June 2013, concluding nearly 40 years of Type 42 operations without the close-in defences that might have saved her tragic sister ships. The Type 45. Daring class represents the ultimate dichotomy of modern naval engineering, a masterclass in weapons capability wrapped in a deeply troubled procurement program. Commissioned between 2009 and 2013, only 6 of the originally planned 12 ships were ever built. Equipped with the revolutionary Samson radar and the principal anti-air missile system, the Type 45 can track and destroy ballistic missiles, supersonic anti-ship weapons and massed swarm attacks simultaneously, securing its reputation as a world-class air defender. Yet, beneath this high-tech shield lies a crippling vulnerability. The advanced WR-21 gas turbines suffer from a persistent design flaw prone to total failure in warm water environments like the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. In 2017, HMS Daring lost all propulsion in the Gulf, requiring a humiliating tow to port. This triggered the expensive multi-year power improvement project to retrofit additional diesel generators, moving at a snail's pace. Furthermore, slashing the fleet from 12 hulls to just 6 left the Royal Navy with 0 operational redundancy. Managed as a precious, overstretched resource rather than an expandable fleet reserve, these state-of-the-art warships must shoulder global commitments with a razor-thin margin for error. The stakes could not be higher. Commissioned between 1892 and 1897, the 21 ships of the Apollo class and 9 of the Eclipse class represented the absolute pinnacle of Victorian second-class protected cruisers. This design philosophy relied heavily on a curved, armoured deck shielding the vital machinery and ammunition magazines, providing essential resilience against enemy shell fire without the crippling weight of heavy waterline hull armour. Displacing between 3,400 and 5,600 tons and packing a punch with 2 6-inch and 6 4.7-inch guns, these warships were perfectly optimized to hunt down hostile commerce raiders and suppress local colonial forces from Zanzibar to Shanghai. However, this engineering choice was a known strategic compromise. While an armoured belt could stop shells at the waterline, a protected deck only absorbed impacts after the enemy rounds had already torn through the thin outer hull plates. During the brutal opening months of World War I, the Royal Navy found a desperate new purpose for these aging vessels. Converted into specialised mine layers, their internal armoured decks provided critical blast protection during high-risk operations. Ships like HMS Latona and HMS Apollo became the backbone of Britain's early wartime mining campaigns, proving that even outdated Victorian steel could adapt to modern industrial conflict across the globe. The 6 mighty ships of the Cressy class, entering service between 1901 and 1902, stood proudly as the Royal Navy's premier first-class armoured cruisers. Tipping the scales at a massive 12,000 tons, they bristled with deadly 9.2-inch main batteries and boasted a formidable 152mm armoured belt. This protection actually surpassed the Japanese armoured cruisers that famously triumphed at Tsushima. Yet, on the fateful morning of September 22, 1914, steel armour proved useless against a silent, invisible threat. While patrolling the treacherous broad 14s of the North Sea without destroyer escorts, HMS Aboukir, HMS Cressy, and HMS Hood were ambushed by the lone German submarine U-9 under Otto Weddigen. Aboukir was struck first. In a noble but catastrophic error, Cressy and Hood stopped dead in the water to rescue drowning comrades, turning themselves into stationary targets. Within 67 nightmarish minutes, all 3 Leviathans were sent to the bottom, taking 1,459 British sailors with them. This staggering disaster fundamentally shocked the Admiralty, exposing the terrible vulnerability of unescorted heavy warships and forcing the rapid, painful development of modern convoy tactics and anti-submarine screening procedures that would eventually reshape 20th century naval warfare across the globe forever. The Drake and Warrior classes, comprising 4 powerful warships each, commissioned between 1902 and 1906, pushed the traditional armoured cruiser concept to its absolute structural and technological limits. Displacing a staggering 14,100 tons and capable of achieving an impressive 23 knots, these massive vessels carried a ferocious arsenal of 2 9.2-inch and 16 6-inch guns, all shielded behind 152mm of solid belt armour. Despite their imposing strength, the relentless march of naval technology quickly turned them into relics. This grim reality was realised in blood on May 31, 1916, at the Battle of Jutland. HMS Defence, a proud member of the Warrior class, was caught in a devastating concentrated crossfire from German capital ships. Heavily damaged and burning, she was struck by a final, catastrophic volley. Her magazines detonated in a colossal fireball, and she vanished beneath the waves in mere seconds, taking all 903 crewmen down with her. Just over a year later, on October 2, 1917, HMS Drake met a similar tragic fate, torpedoed by the German submarine U-79 while escorting a vital Atlantic convoy. Their violent losses definitively closed the era of first-class armoured cruisers in active British frontline service. The 3 revolutionary ships of the Invincible class, arriving in 1908, represented Admiral John Fisher's most radical and ultimately most dangerous naval innovation. By packing Dreadnought caliber 12-inch main guns and a blistering 25.5 knot top speed into a sleek 17,250-ton hull, Fisher created a warship faster than any contemporary battleship and infinitely more lethal than any existing cruiser. Yet, A fatal flaw lay hidden beneath this impressive firepower, a meager 152 millimeters of maximum belt armor. Fisher arrogantly dismissed this weakness, famously claiming that speed was the ship's best defense. Early on, the concept seemed vindicated. At the Battle of the Falkland Islands in late 1914, Invincible and Inflexible easily hunted down and obliterated Vice Admiral Graf von Spey's outgunned East Asia squadron. But the ultimate test came at the Battle of Jutland on May 31st, 1916. Locked in combat with the German battlecruiser Lützow, HMS Invincible took a direct hit to her Q turret. The flash instantly reached the unprotected magazines, triggering an apocalyptic explosion that tore the ship completely in two. Out of 1,032 men aboard, only 6 miraculously survived, exposing Fisher's speed as armor doctrine as a tragic, bloody illusion of security. The 3 massive warships of the Lion-class, entering royal service between 1912 and 1913, formed the formidable second generation of British battlecruisers. Recognizing the vulnerability of their predecessors, designers upscaled these new vessels to pack a crushing main battery of 13.5-inch guns and reinforced their hulls with thickened 229mm armored belts. While this was a genuine engineering improvement, it ultimately remained inadequate against the high-velocity armor-piercing shells fired by German battlecruisers at realistic combat ranges. The terrifying cost of this lingering design compromise was paid in full on May 31st, 1916, at the Battle of Jutland. HMS Queen Mary, a sister variant, was hammered by a relentless hail of heavy gunfire from the German battlecruisers Derfflinger and Seydlitz. A shell penetrated her forward armor, detonating the main magazines. The resulting explosion was so immense it was visible to both fleets across miles of ocean. In an instant, 1,266 brave sailors perished, leaving a mere 9 survivors. The flagship of the class, HMS Lion, narrowly escaped a similar catastrophic fate at both Dogger Bank and Jutland, surviving only because enemy shells happened to miss her vital ammunition storage spaces entirely. Commissioned on May 15, 1920, HMS Hood was the sole survivor of the aborted 4-ship Admiral class. For over 2 decades, she reigned supreme as the largest and most awe-inspiring warship on Earth, a majestic floating symbol of global British maritime hegemony. Displacing more than 42,000 tons and stretching 262 meters, her incredible 31-knot speed made her a lethal weapon on paper. While she incorporated several crucial post-Jutland armor upgrades, designers tragically stopped short of the thick horizontal deck plating required to deflect plunging long-range gunfire. Her planned sister ships, Anson, Howe, and Rodney, were cancelled under the strict tonnage caps of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. Left alone, Hood's fatal design flaw was exposed on May 24, 1941, in the frozen expanse of the Denmark Strait. Just 8 minutes into a furious duel with the German battleship Bismarck, a catastrophic 38-centimeter salvo pierced Hood's thin deck armor and detonated her aft 15-inch magazines. The pride of the Royal Navy broke apart and plunged beneath the waves in 3 terrifying minutes. Of her 1,418 crew, only 3 survived, proving one final devastating time the vulnerability of the battlecruiser concept. The 28 light cruisers of the expansive C and D classes rushed into active service between 1915 and 1918, served as the indispensable backbone of the Royal Navy's scouting forces during the dark years of World War I. Mass-produced under urgent war emergency conditions using highly standardized industrial components, these nimble vessels successfully maintained the blistering 29-knot top speed required to outrun capital ships, while carrying sufficient firepower to contest hostile German scout fleets. Most famously, the C-class formed the cutting edge of Commodore Reginald Tyrwhitt's legendary Harwich Force, a highly mobile naval strike team that relentlessly contested control of the southern North Sea. Their brilliant combination of rapid-fire guns and deadly torpedo arrays made them the ultimate fleet screening assets. Following the armistice, a massive surplus of these hulls established a geopolitical pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century as Britain transferred or sold these battle-tested warships to emerging Commonwealth and Allied navies. By the late 1930s, several surviving C-class hulls underwent extensive modifications to become dedicated anti-aircraft cruisers, paving the technological path for the next generation of purpose-built fleet defense warships to come. The 5 unique vessels of the Hawkins class, commissioned between 1919 and 1925, occupy a legendary position in modern naval history because their massive physical dimensions literally rewrote the international rules of warship construction. When global superpowers met for the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 to halt a ruinous global arms race, negotiators used the imposing Hawkins class as the absolute ceiling for future heavy cruiser designs, establishing a strict legal limit of 10,000 tons, displacement and 8-inch main armaments. Consequently, every single treaty cruiser built by rival global navies for the next 2 decades was shaped by the specific standard this single British class had established. The ships themselves faced mixed fortunes. HMS Raleigh was tragically wrecked off Labrador in 1922, while Cavendish was radically transformed into an early aircraft carrier named HMS Vindictive. The surviving sisters pressed on, providing vital service into World War II. HMS Effingham was lost after striking an uncharted rock during the chaotic 1940 Norwegian campaign, but her remaining sisters continued escorting convoys, ultimately outliving the very treaty limits their design had inadvertently imposed upon the world's navies from the beginning. The 7 ships of the Kent class and 4 of the closely related London class entering service between 1928 and 1929 were the very first heavy cruisers built by Great Britain under the restrictive limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty. Armed with 8 powerful 8-inch guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, capable of steaming at 31.5 knots, and precisely matching the 9,750-ton legal standard, they represented the absolute limit of engineering possibility. However, staying under the strict tonnage cap required a dangerous sacrifice: armor protection. The meager 25mm armored belt provided by designers was barely capable of deflecting light 6-inch cruiser shells and completely useless against heavy 8-inch rounds. This structural vulnerability yielded tragic results during World War II. On April 5, 1942, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire were caught in the open waters of the Indian Ocean without vital air cover. Spotted by Japanese carrier aircraft from Admiral Nagumo's elite First Air Fleet, both heavy cruisers were relentlessly bombed and sunk within 20 minutes, leaving 424 dead. Conversely, their sister HMS Suffolk achieved legendary status by utilizing her advanced radar to track the Bismarck for 31 hours during the dramatic 1941 Atlantic chase. Comprising just two legendary vessels, HMS York and HMS Exeter, commissioned in 1930 and 1931, the York class represented a bold, cost-saving experiment in scaled-down, heavy cruiser design. By reducing the main battery from 8 to 6 8-inch guns, British naval architect teams successfully created a more economical warship with a much smaller displacement. Despite their reduced size, these ships carved out an immortal legacy in the opening salvos of World War II. At the historic Battle of the River Plate on December 13, 1939, HMS Exeter courageously engaged the heavily armed German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. Absorbing a brutal pounding from 11-inch shells that shattered two of her main turrets and claimed 61 lives, Exeter refused to yield, fighting on as a mangled wreck until the cornered German raider was driven into Montevideo and scuttled. Tragically, both sister ships would ultimately succumb to the relentless violence of global war. HMS Exeter was finally overwhelmed and sunk by Japanese heavy cruisers in the Java Sea on March 1, 1942, while HMS York was fatally crippled by daring Italian explosive motorboats in Crete's Suda Bay, forcing her crew to permanently beach her in the shallow waters. The 8 exceptionally designed light cruisers of the Leander class, entering service between 1933 and 1935, represented a masterful triumph of British naval engineering. 5 ships served directly with the Royal Navy, while 3 were proudly transferred to the Royal New Zealand Navy. Sized at a modest 7,270 tons, these warships were brilliantly optimized to carry a powerful main battery of 8 6-inch guns in a highly efficient layout that easily matched the offensive punch of much larger international designs. Their combat record throughout World War II was nothing short of legendary. HMS Achilles carved her name into history at the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939, relentlessly dueling the German pocket battleship Graf Spee despite suffering lethal 11-inch shell fragments that devastated her bridge. Later, in the Pacific Theatre, her sister HMS Leander was heavily damaged after being struck by a Japanese torpedo during the chaotic night action at the Battle of Kolombangara in July 1943. Thanks to their incredibly rugged construction and inherently sound basic design, 3 New Zealand Leanders survived the war and remained active into the 1960s, proving the enduring value of this versatile cruiser class. The 10 formidable warships of the Southampton class entering active fleet service between 1937 and 1939 were Britain's direct tactical response to heavily armed Japanese light cruisers carrying 15 6-inch guns. These upsized British vessels packed an immense punch, carrying 12 6-inch guns in 4 advanced triple turrets, dramatically increasing their offensive capability over previous cruiser generations. Their operational history reads like an epic chronicle of World War II's most dangerous naval campaigns. HMS Sheffield achieved immortal fame during the dramatic 1941 Atlantic chase, braving treacherous Arctic weather to maintain continuous radar contact on the elusive German battleship Bismarck for 31 critical hours. However, the class paid a staggering price for its constant front-line deployments. HMS Edinburgh was tragically lost in the freezing waters of the Barents Sea on May 2, 1942, while secretly carrying a priceless cargo of 93 tons of Soviet gold bullion to pay for Western war supplies. 57 crewmen perished with her, though the gold was remarkably recovered in a daring 1981 salvage operation. Two other sister ships, HMS Manchester and HMS Southampton, were also lost to fierce enemy torpedo and bombing attacks during the war. The 16 highly specialized warships of the Dido class, including the revised Bellona subgroup commissioned between 1940 and 1945, were engineered from the keel up to counter the terrifying evolution of modern air power. Designed specifically as dedicated anti-aircraft cruisers, their primary armament consisted of 10 rapid-fire 5.25-inch dual-purpose guns, capable of throwing up devastating flak walls against high-altitude bombers while remaining deadly to surface targets. However, the limits of this specialized design were tested in blood during the brutal 1941 Battle of Crete. German dive bombers relentlessly targeted the fleet, sinking both HMS Gloucester and HMS Fiji in a single catastrophic afternoon. Crucially, Fiji had completely exhausted her anti-aircraft ammunition supply, leaving her completely defenseless and desperately firing non-lethal practice rounds when the fatal bombs struck home. Gloucester was lost while bravely attempting to rescue her sister's survivors, resulting in the tragic loss of 722 British sailors. This grim disaster provided a stark lesson to the Admiralty. Anti-aircraft warships were only as effective as their magazine capacities, forcing immediate, sweeping overhauls to fleet ammunition stowage, logistics, and replenishment protocols across the entire Royal Navy fleet operations. The 14 rugged warships of the Fiji and Colony classes, commissioned into service between 1940 and 1944, stood as the indispensable, hard-fighting workhorses of the mid-war Royal Navy. Cleverly designed to maximize firepower under strict wartime constraints, the Fiji class managed to pack 12 powerful 6-inch guns into 4 triple turrets on a compact 8,000-ton hull, a full 2,000 tons lighter than the preceding Town class. These tough cruisers proved their immense worth in every major theatre of conflict. Most famously, HMS Jamaica played a decisive role at the historic Battle of the North Cape on December 26, 1943. Operating in pitch-black Arctic conditions, she helped corner the elusive German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, delivering the final, crushing torpedo strikes that sent the German Titan to the bottom of the ocean. That fierce engagement ended with the loss of 1,932 German sailors, with only 36 survivors rescued from the freezing waves. Following the Allied victory, these highly versatile and reliable warships found new life on the global stage, with 6 Colony-class vessels being transferred to form the foundational backbone of emerging Commonwealth navies in Canada, India, Pakistan, and New Zealand, respectively. Comprising just 2 exceptional vessels, HMS Edinburgh and HMS Belfast, commissioned in 1939, the Edinburgh class represented the absolute pinnacle of British light cruiser design during World War II. Heavily armed with 12 6-inch guns and featuring a comprehensively upgraded radar-controlled anti-aircraft suite, these massive vessels possessed unparalleled combat versatility. HMS Belfast carved an indelible legacy across the pages of 20th century history, executing vital roles at the Battle of the North Cape in 1943 and providing devastating shore bombardment support during the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. Her massive guns pounded fortified German positions from 11 kilometers offshore, clearing the way for Allied infantry storming Sword Beach. Decades later, she would serve with distinction in the Korean War, cementing her status as the final Royal Navy cruiser to fire her primary armaments in anger. Safely preserved as a floating museum ship on the River Thames since October 21st, 1971, Belfast remains the world's last surviving example of the classic big-gun cruiser. Her tragic sister ship, HMS Edinburgh, rests undisturbed at a depth of 245 meters in the Barents Sea, a war grave containing 57 brave sailors and 93 tons of sunken Soviet gold. The 6 advanced vessels of the Swiftsure class and its Ontario subgroup, commissioned between 1944 and 1946, represented the final evolution of British light cruiser design conceived during the crucible of World War II. These modern ships seamlessly integrated the hard-won combat lessons of the preceding Fiji and Colony classes, introducing heavily reinforced anti-aircraft defensive arrays and cutting-edge electronic fire control radar systems. As the geopolitical landscape shifted toward the looming Cold War, 2 prominent Swiftsure-class ships, HMS Ontario and HMS Quebec, were transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy, either immediately prior to or shortly after completion. These Canadian vessels served with great distinction throughout the 1950s, anchoring a surface fleet adapting to new global threats. Meanwhile, their British sister ships, including HMS Swiftsure and HMS Superb, continued to fly the White Ensign until the early 1960s, though their active operational roles were progressively scaled back as aircraft and missiles advanced. Both cruisers were ultimately sold for scrap in the mid-1960s, marking the end of distinguished operational careers that witnessed a total transformation from traditional blue water fleet engagements to modern amphibious and Cold War perimeter patrols worldwide. The 3 troubled warships of the Tiger class represented both a remarkable engineering feat and the absolute end of the line for the traditional British cruiser. With construction originally halting at the close of World War II, the program endured 14 agonizing years of repeated cancellations, redesigns, and suspensions before the lead ship finally entered active fleet service in 1959. The centerpiece of this delayed design was a fully automatic, rapid-fire, twin 6-inch turret capable of cycling an astonishing 20 rounds per minute per barrel. While a brilliant technical achievement, its immense mechanical complexity imposed grueling maintenance demands that a shrinking post-war Navy desperately lacked the technical manpower to sustain. Consequently, HMS Lion was quickly forced into reserve, while Tiger and Blake underwent massive reconstructions in the late 1960s, transforming into hybrid helicopter cruisers. When HMS Tiger was permanently decommissioned in 1979, she retired as the final cruiser to serve the Royal Navy, and the very last gun-armed cruiser in any Western fleet. Her departure quietly brought down the curtain on a century of big gun dominance, leaving naval warfare forever altered by the rise of guided missiles and naval aviation. Commissioned on March 31, 1973, HMS Bristol was the lone survivor of the ill-fated 4-ship Type 82 class, designed specifically to serve as the ultimate high-tech escort for Britain's planned CVA-01 fleet aircraft carriers. However, when the entire carrier program was abruptly cancelled in the infamous 1966 Defence White Paper, the underlying strategic rationale for the Type 82 destroyers evaporated overnight. Bristol was only completed because her hull was too far advanced to abandon economically, while her 3 planned sisters were immediately axed on the drawing board. Displacing a hefty 6,100 tons, this unique vessel straddled the fine line between heavy destroyer and light cruiser. Despite her orphaned status, Bristol served as a crucial floating testbed, pioneering an innovative combined gas turbine propulsion plant that marked the Royal Navy's first all-gas turbine surface combatant. This groundbreaking propulsion layout proved highly successful, directly shaping the engineering of the subsequent Type 42 destroyers. Reassigned primarily to a training role from the mid-1970s onward, Bristol spent nearly 30 years operating as a stationary schoolship before being decommissioned in 2004 and scrapped, a solitary monument to an aircraft carrier era that never was. The Holland-class 5 boats built at Vickers, Sons and Maxim at Barrow-in-Furness between 1901 and 1903 were Britain's first operational submarines, purchased from the Electric Boat Company under licence from inventor John Philip Holland after years of Admiralty resistance had been overcome by the practical demonstration that other navies, notably France, were actively building submarines that threatened British surface supremacy. The Royal Navy bought them not with enthusiasm, but with the pragmatic recognition that if they could not be prevented, they should at least be understood. At 113 tons surfaced and 19.5 metres length, the Hollands were marginal platforms, gasoline engines that produced toxic fumes below deck, single torpedo tubes that required the entire boat to be aimed at the target, and a surface speed of 7.4 knots that made them tactical curiosities rather than strategic weapons. Holland once sank accidentally off Plymouth in 1913 when ballast tank valves were left open during towing. She was raised in 1982 and is preserved at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport. Their importance was institutional rather than operational. The officers who trained on Hollands 1 through 5 developed the procedural and tactical frameworks that subsequent classes would inherit. The submarine service began not with a triumph, but with 5 barely functional boats that taught the Royal Navy, grudgingly, that submarines were here to stay. The A and B classes, 13 A boats and 11 B boats built between 1903 and 1906, represented iterative improvements on the Holland design. The A-class moved to a more powerful petrol engine. The B-class, at 287 tons surfaced, was the first British submarine considered capable of independent coastal operations. Neither class was safe by any standard. Petrol fumes, primitive ventilation, and single-hull construction made operations consistently dangerous. A 1 was sunk in a collision with the passenger steamer Berwick Castle off Portsmouth on March 18, 1904, drowning all 11 crew, the first Royal Navy submarine fatality. The loss prompted improved collision procedures, but not the kind of systemic redesign that would have required admitting that the entire A-class design was fundamentally hazardous. B-11 under Lieutenant Norman Holbrook earned the Royal Navy's first Victoria Cross of World War I on December 13, 1914, penetrating the Dardanelles minefields, diving under 5 rows of mines and torpedoing the Ottoman pre-dreadnought Masudia at anchor in Sari Siglar Bay. It was the first time a submarine had sunk a capital warship in combat, a tactical proof of concept that navies around the world immediately absorbed. The C, D and E classes represent the developmental arc that produced Britain's first genuinely capable offensive submarines. The C class resolved the gasoline engine problem by introducing heavier oil engines. The D class introduced diesel propulsion, saddle tanks, and wireless telegraphy. The E-class, 55 boats built between 1912 and 1917, was the first British submarine designed from the outset for fleet operations. E-11 Under Commander Martin Nasmyth conducted the most remarkable campaign of British submarine history in 1915, 3 patrols in the Sea of Marmara, penetrating through the Dardanelles minefields each time, sinking 98 vessels totaling 98,000 tons, including the pre-dreadnought Barbaros Hayreddin. Nasmyth received the Victoria Cross. E-class losses were heavy. Of 55 boats, 28 were lost in combat, a 51% attrition rate. The E-class proved what submarines could accomplish. The losses proved the cost. Both proofs were noted and both were accepted as the price of undersea warfare. The K-class was the Royal Navy's attempt to build a submarine fast enough to operate with the Grand Fleet's battle squadrons, a concept that required surface speeds of 24 knots that diesel engines could not provide, and that steam turbines, with all their hazardous complexity, could. K-class boats required approximately 5 minutes to dive. 5 minutes was tactical eternity. On January 31st, 1918, during a fleet exercise in the Firth of Forth, designated Exercise EC-1, a series of collisions in poor visibility destroyed 5 K-class submarines and damaged 3 more. K-4 and K-17 sank. 105 men died. No enemy was involved. The event, known as the Battle of May Island, was the worst submarine disaster in British history. The K-class never sank an enemy vessel. All 18 built were scrapped by 1931. The program consumed resources that could have produced twice as many E-class boats, and was sustained primarily by institutional commitment to a fleet submarine concept that the design's fatal limitations eventually made undeniable. The L-class, 27 boats commissioned between 1917 and 1924, was the evolutionary successor to the E-class, increasing displacement to 890 tons, upgrading to 21-inch torpedoes, and incorporating 4 years of wartime submarine operational lessons. The M-class, 3 boats, represented the most eccentric concept in British submarine history. Submarines armed with a single 12-inch naval gun, the same caliber as a battleship. M1 was completed in 1918, too late to be tested in combat. M1 was sunk in collision with the Swedish coaster Vidar off Start Point on November 12, 1925, taking all 69 crew members to the bottom, the worst Royal Navy submarine accident of the interwar period. M2 was converted to carry a small seaplane, flooded and sank on January 26, 1932, when the watertight hangar door was left open during diving. M3 was converted to a mine layer. The OP and R classes, 18 ocean-going submarines built between 1927 and 1931, were designed for patrol operations in distant waters, specifically the Pacific and Indian Ocean theatres, where Britain's imperial commitments required submarines capable of sustained long-range operations. At 9,800 nautical miles, range at 8 knots, these boats could operate from Singapore or Hong Kong without need for forward bases. The losses were concentrated in 2 theatres: the Mediterranean, where Italian and German anti-submarine forces progressively improved, and the Far East, where Japanese air power overwhelmed British forces simultaneously with Pearl Harbor. Of the 18 boats, 9 were lost in combat, a 50% attrition rate. The T-class, 53 boats built between 1937 and 1945, was designed around an extraordinary armament of 11 forward-firing 21-inch torpedo tubes, enabling a salvo that could saturate any target's defensive maneuvering. No other submarine class in history matched this forward salvo weight. HMS Thetis sank during acceptance trials in Liverpool Bay on June 1, 1939, when a torpedo tube rear door was opened while the bow cap was also open. 99 men died, naval personnel, Vickers workers, an observer, in one of the worst pre-war submarine disasters. The escape apparatus worked for 4 men. T-class boats fought throughout the Atlantic, Mediterranean and Pacific. Post-war, many were streamlined and served into the 1960s as NATO Cold War submarines, the primary forces available during the early Cold War years before the nuclear program delivered its first boats. The S and U classes were Britain's medium and coastal submarines of World War II, providing the bulk of operational boats in the Mediterranean and coastal waters theatres. The S-class, at 768 tons, became the most numerically significant British submarine of the war, 62 built. The U-class, at 540 tons, was the smallest seagoing submarine in British service. HMS Upholder, under Lieutenant Commander Malcolm David Wanklyn, became the Royal Navy's most successful World War II submarine commander, 24 combat patrols from Malta, sinking the troopship Conte Rosso, the liner Neptunia and Oceania, the cruiser Museo Attendolo, and 97,000 tons of Axis shipping in total. Wanklyn received the Victoria Cross, the DSO with 2 bars, and the Lloyd's War Medal. HMS Upholder was sunk on April 14, 1942 by the Italian torpedo boat Pegaso. All 32 crew members died, including Wanklyn. The submarine service's most decorated officer was 32 years old. The A and V classes, the final British submarine designs to enter service before the nuclear age, were ordered in large numbers in 1943 and 1944 in anticipation of the Pacific Campaign's demands. 46 A-class boats were ordered. The war ended before most could be completed and 30 were cancelled. The 16 that were completed formed the backbone of the post-war conventional submarine fleet. Several A-class boats were sold to Allied navies, establishing the pattern of submarine support that would eventually produce the Upholder-class export programs. The A-class boats that served into the 1970s did so as the gap was filled by the nuclear program. Their phase-out was determined not by age but by the decision that nuclear submarines would replace conventional ones across the entire attack submarine role. HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur were Britain's attempt to develop the high-test peroxide turbine technology captured from German Type 17 boats at the end of World War II, the propulsion system that had demonstrated 25 knots submerged. Britain built 2 experimental boats using the Walter cycle in the early 1950s to evaluate whether HTP could produce the high submerged speed that would render conventional anti-submarine warfare obsolete. Both demonstrated the submerged speeds promised, exceeding 25 knots, and both confirmed the fundamental problem: HTP was an extraordinarily hazardous oxidant. Explorer earned the nickname HMS Exploder among her crew for a succession of HTP-related fires and incidents. The program was abandoned by the late 1950s after an evaluation that concluded HTP's operational hazards made it unacceptable for fleet service. Both boats were scrapped in the 1960s. The target speed they had demonstrated was achieved instead by HMS Dreadnought through nuclear propulsion in 1963. The HTP program's failure confirmed that the performance requirement was real and that the solution would have to come from a completely different technology path. The Porpoise class, 8 boats commissioned between 1958 and 1961, was the first British submarine class designed specifically for post-war Cold War requirements. Incorporating lessons from the Type 21 electro-boot technical documentation recovered in Germany in 1945, the Porpoise class featured streamlined hull form, large battery banks for high submerged speed, and a sonar suite optimized for the North Atlantic. The design represented a genuinely important advance. Submerged speed of 17 knots exceeded that of most Cold War Soviet submarines. The streamlined hull reduced acoustic signature, and the Type 187 sonar suite provided passive detection capability that informed the tactical doctrine British submarines would use for the next 30 years. All 8 were retired by 1987 as the Oberon class fully replaced them, and the nuclear boats took over fleet tasks. HMS Porpoise served for 29 years without serious incident, a reliability record that testified to sound, basic design. The Oberon class, 27 boats total, 13 for the Royal Navy, and 14 export, built between 1959 and 1978, was the most commercially successful British submarine design in history, and the class that sustained British conventional submarine capability through the critical transition years of the nuclear program. 14 Oberons were sold to Australia, Canada, Chile, and Brazil, the largest British submarine export program, establishing relationships with allied navies and generating revenue that Vickers and the government used to offset nuclear submarine construction costs. 2 Royal Navy Oberons, HMS Onyx and HMS Spartan, deployed to the South Atlantic during the Falklands War of 1982. Onyx provided intelligence-gathering special forces insertion and surveillance operations that the surface force could not safely conduct under Argentine air threat. The Oberon served until the early 1990s. The Upholder class, 4 boats, HMS Upholder, Unseen, Ursula, and Unicorn, was the last conventional submarine the Royal Navy would operate, built at a cost of £200 million per hull and paid off without having conducted a single operational patrol. The Strategic Defence Review of 1993 and 1994 concluded that the Royal Navy would maintain only nuclear submarines. All 4 upholders were placed in extended readiness within months of commissioning. Canada purchased all 4 in 1998 for $750 million Canadian dollars. Renamed the Victoria class, HMCS Chicoutimi suffered a fire in 2004 that killed Lieutenant Chris Saunders, the first Canadian submarine death in decades. The Upholder class that Britain had built and abandoned was now killing Canadians. Britain's decision to abandon conventional submarines entirely has been periodically questioned, but never reversed. HMS Dreadnought, commissioned April 17, 1963, was Britain's first nuclear-powered submarine, and her existence depended entirely on a technology transfer agreement with the United States that was, at the time, without precedent in nuclear history. President Eisenhower agreed in 1958 to provide Britain with a complete American S-5W reactor system, along with the technical data, enriched uranium, and operational assistance required to make it work. Britain was the only nation to receive American nuclear submarine technology under such terms. Dreadnought was laid down at Vickers Armstrong in Barrow-in-Furness on June 12, 1959, and took nearly 4 years to build. She commissioned with a mixed crew of Royal Navy submariners who had trained in American nuclear submarines for 2 years. Dreadnought served for 17 years before being paid off in 1980. She demonstrated what was already known: Nuclear propulsion transformed submarines from vessels that occasionally submerged into vessels that occasionally surfaced, and that transformation was irreversible for any navy that could afford it. The Valiant and Warspite, two boats commissioned in 1966 and 1967, were the first British nuclear submarines powered by a domestically developed reactor, the Rolls-Royce PWR-1, which Britain had developed independently after acquiring the American S-5W understanding through Dreadnought. HMS Conqueror, a Churchill-class successor, sank the Argentine cruiser ARA General Belgrano on May 2, 1982, with Mk8 torpedoes, the only time a nuclear-powered submarine has sunk a warship in combat. 323 Argentine sailors died. The entire Argentine surface fleet subsequently withdrew to territorial waters and remained there for the Falklands War's duration. One sinking neutralized a navy. The Churchill class, 5 boats including Conqueror, formed the core of the Royal Navy's SSN force through the 1970s and 1980s. HMS Conqueror remains the only nuclear submarine to have used its weapons against a surface vessel. The Swiftsure class, 6 boats commissioned between 1973 and 1981, was the first British SSN class designed without direct American technical input, and the first to achieve submerged performance that made it genuinely competitive with contemporary Soviet submarines in the North Atlantic. HMS Spartan conducted under-ice Arctic operations in 1986, proving British nuclear submarine capability in environments strategically important given Soviet SSBN patrol areas under the Arctic ice cap. HMS Splendid became the first Royal Navy submarine to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles in combat during Operation Allied Force in 1999, attacking Serbian targets during the Kosovo campaign, the first time a British submarine had struck targets on land using a cruise missile. All 6 Swiftsure-class submarines were retired between 2004 and 2010. Like all British nuclear submarines, they await disposal in a program that remains unfunded to the degree required for near-term resolution. Britain has become the nation with more submarines awaiting disposal than currently in service. The Trafalgar class, 7 boats commissioned between 1983 and 1991, was the most operationally active British submarine class in history, participating in 4 distinct combat operations across 2 decades and establishing the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile as a permanent component of British submarine capability. HMS Trafalgar and other boats of the class fired Tomahawk missiles in the 1991 Gulf War. Subsequent operations in Kosovo, Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011 established a continuous operational tempo that demonstrated the strategic utility of nuclear submarines as strike platforms against non-naval targets. HMS Turbulent fired Tomahawks against Iraqi targets in 2003, the longest-ranged maritime strike operation in Royal Navy history. The last Trafalgar-class boat, HMS Triumph, was retired in 2022, leaving the Royal Navy dependent entirely on the Astute class for its SSN force, while Astute program delivery delays created a temporary and deeply uncomfortable capability gap. The Vanguard class 4 boats, HMS Vanguard, Victorious, Vigilant and Vengeance, commissioned between 1993 and 1999, carries Britain's entire nuclear deterrent. Each boat carries up to 16 Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles with a range exceeding 7,400 kilometers. 1 boat is always on patrol, a cycle of continuous at-sea deterrence maintained without interruption since April 1969. The Vanguard class at 15 feet 900 tons surfaced is the largest submarine Britain has ever built. The Rolls-Royce PWR-2 reactor provides life of boat fuel without refueling. The successor Dreadnought class, 4 boats planned, first expected in the early 2030s, is already consuming a significant portion of the defence budget while still under construction. The gap between Vanguard's end of life and Dreadnought's introduction is the primary driver of Britain's submarine procurement schedule. No other capability in the British defence inventory has equivalent priority. The Astute class, 7 boats ordered, 5 commissioned, 2 building as of 2024, is the most complex manufactured object Britain has ever produced. More than 1 million components, 97 kilometres of pipe, 39,000 acoustic tiles, and a nuclear reactor plant that will never require refueling in the boat's operational life. HMS Astute commissioned on August 27, 2010, 5 years late and significantly over budget. The programme had experienced catastrophic difficulties in its early years when the design team lost continuity with Trafalgar-class design documentation, forcing reconstruction of the technical baseline at enormous cost. The 5 boats in service as of 2024 are the Royal Navy's entire SSN force. When HMS Triumph was retired in 2022, the Royal Navy briefly operated fewer attack submarines than at any point since the early Cold War. The combination of undersea manoeuvre, acoustic stealth and precision land attack capability makes each Astute a genuine multi-domain warship. There are 5 of them. The question of whether 5 is enough for British strategic commitments is, in 2024, not academic.